The Aldus podcast is brought to you by Aldus International, supplying your expert AI and digital transformation staffing needs across the US and Europe. Today, you are listening to our ServiceNow series, where we interview the best and brightest of the industry to share their story, advice, and views on the exciting world of ServiceNow and digital transformation.
Hello everybody, it is Mark Kelly here. Hope you're doing really well. I'm Chief Customer Officer at Aldus, and part of our ServiceNow series within our Aldus podcast, I am delighted to welcome Ryan Smith, Director of ServiceNow Alliance at Own Backup, and Jean Oon, Director of Product Marketing at Own Backup. Ryan and Jean, thank you very much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thanks, Mark. It's great to be here.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate it.
Ryan, could I start with you? Could you tell us a little bit about your role and responsibilities at Own Backup? And if you wouldn't mind, for people who've been living under a rock, tell us a little bit about Own Backup as well. And then I'll pass that on to Jean, if you wouldn't mind doing your the same about your current role and responsibilities at Own Backup.
Great. So I learned about Own Backup, I'd say close to 8 years ago when they started. I was at a startup company in the Salesforce ecosystem. And basically I watched, and we actually were partners with Own Backup for SaaS data security, and they were an outstanding partner, and I loved working with Own Backup as a partner. But one thing that was really impressive to me is watching them kind of go from being a startup with 0 customers to today. Own Backup has over 6,000 customers. They ended up becoming the biggest partner in the Salesforce ecosystem, and I was just really impressed with their growth. Obviously, their product is very sought after and needed in the ecosystem. So when I heard that they were taking Own Backup into the ServiceNow ecosystem and we're looking for a ServiceNow Alliance Director to kind of help align with ServiceNow and bring our offering into that ecosystem, I was, kind of first in line to raise my hand and say, hey, I want to be a part of this. So go ahead.
Yeah, I learned about Own Backup while I was at ServiceNow. And I actually joined Own Backup only in October of 2022, so relatively new to the company. But before that, I was at ServiceNow. I led product marketing for the Now platform. And when I heard about Own Backup, it was actually a recruiter that had reached out to me. My first reaction was, well, don't we back up our data? Like, why would anybody really need to back up their data on their own if they're using a SaaS application? And then Ryan's going to talk a little bit about the shared responsibility model. But when I kind of learned about like the fact that SaaS companies really do they back up your data, but they don't necessarily provide you with a solution for recovering your data in a way that's going to really protect your data in a way it's going to allow you to continue on with your business as usual. As I learned more about it, we got really excited about the opportunity and made the jump over to Own Backup.
Thank you for that, Ryan and Jean. And Ryan, would you go into a little bit more detail about Own Backup and what they do and how they do that?
So basically, yeah, Jean mentioned the shared responsibility model. All SaaS platforms have this shared responsibility model, which basically says, the SaaS provider like ServiceNow, Salesforce, Microsoft, whoever it may be, they're responsible for the infrastructure of the platform to make sure it works. The customers are responsible for the data that goes in that platform. A lot of people aren't aware of this. So we spend a lot of time, helping folks educate themselves about this. Customers, there's a myth. They just assume that ServiceNow is responsible for their data if something goes wrong, or they're to lose all their data for all the reasons that, human error. There's a ton of reasons how data loss happens, but it happens all the time. So ServiceNow does an outstanding job at their upholding their responsibility, and we are in here to help the customers take care of their responsibility, and that's kind of what the shirt's about, is own your data. So
yeah, just to add to what Ryan said, it's like you said, there's many different ways that companies sometimes lose data or run into a data corruption. Like you said, there's definitely human error. There's times when people, do an integration that may have some sort of an issue with it that ends up, either deleting or corrupting data. There's bad code, unfortunately. There's, data migrations. There's all kinds of different, sources of data loss and corruption. And our solution is really there to help our customers, restore that data in a self-service fashion and be able to, to kind of, minimize their business disruption whenever that happens.
And people can really underestimate the impact when something like this actually happens to the business on data that they may not think is that important, but turns out to be crucial because they expect that there's certain steps that are already included. And if you're on the other side of that, it can be very, very painful.
Yeah, absolutely. When you think about the types of data that customers are, managing within ServiceNow, obviously there's a broad range. Obviously there's a lot of, IT workflows that ServiceNow customers are managing on the platform. But as ServiceNow has expanded out into different areas of the business, now we're seeing HR data, we're seeing finance data, legal data. Of course, there's risk and compliance data. There's all kinds of very sensitive and important data that's running throughout the platform. And, customers can't afford to have disruptions in, to their business caused by, lost data or corrupted data. So perfect example, we talk to customers every day, who tell us, well, we actually ran into some sort of a corruption or we lost data about 6 months ago, and we really didn't have a way of being able to restore it because we found out about the data corruption or loss, after, well after the retention period for ServiceNow's backups. And so they really had no recourse at that point. So they literally just ended up, cutting their losses and not being able to restore that data. So when you think about some of the applications, like, I'll just, use an example that I heard about the other day, which is IRM, Integrated Risk Management. We were talking to a customer that was managing their SOX compliance in IRM, and they were doing some pretty critical testing in one of their test environments. And another project team that was sharing that test environment with them triggered a clone down from production to that test instance without knowing that there was some pretty critical work that was being done by another team on that same instance. And they literally lost weeks worth of testing data and work that they had set up. And they really had no way of being able to recover that because they didn't discover the issue until, after it was a little bit too late. So that's just one example. I could go through many, different examples. We've talked to customers that have lost data in their CMDB, customers that have lost, their own customer data in CSM. These are really critical, types of data that are being managed within the platform, and having a solution that's going to enable you to quickly restore that data without having to, create more collateral damage in the process is something that customers are really, it really resonates with customers.
And Gene, do you think any particular industries would warrant this more than others? And I personally would probably think the financial industry or healthcare industry that would come to mind. But I suppose every industry, every company could justify having this. Anything particular from your experience?
Yeah, I think you hit the nail on the head. You're pointing out a couple of very highly regulated industries, and backup and recovery is something that all companies need, right? It's not limited to just regulated companies, but when we do talk to companies in financial services, in healthcare, in telecommunications, these are highly regulated industries, and so they have certain data retention requirements. They need to be able to back up data and prove that it's being stored, in an offsite location. There's all kinds of different requirements that necessitates the need for a third-party backup solution like OwnBackup. And I mentioned earlier public, Sarbanes-Oxley. So if you're a public company in the U.S., it's definitely something that is very, very important for companies to be able to comply with. But in financial services, you'll see SEC rules, you'll see Graham-Leach-Bliley. In the UK, there's PRA, operational resilience. There's all kinds of different financial services regulations pertaining to data protection that we help our customers with.
Yeah, and I think the more you look into it, you need to have a pretty good reason not to have a system like this set up for your organization. And because it's a spinning flap or a burning platform, things are changing all the different times. And you could be 6 months, 9 months, 12 months down the line before you even know you've got an issue. And then you're trying to backtrack on that and trying to explain that to shareholders, internal and external. That's not something you want to be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And one thing I'll mention that is interesting is that it's not so much the incidents where customers accidentally delete a massive number of data, a million records at once. Those types of incidents, they're able to they discover those or they find out about those right away. It's the data losses or the corruptions that are much smaller in scale that go undetected, beyond the retention period, that still have a very, significant impact on the business. But you get to that point where if you haven't discovered it in time, if you don't know that you've had a data loss or corruption, well, oftentimes it's too late. And if you don't have a backup that you can go to and recover from, then you really have no options at that point. So that's I think what most of the companies that we talk to or customers that we talk to that are really desperate for a solution like ours are the ones that experience those types of incidents that have been really impacted by that type of situation. And it's usually because they just, they don't know that they've had a data loss until it's too late.
Ryan, you mentioned the growth, and one of the key reasons why you actually joined the company, because you could see how they were scaling and they were doing it very, very, very well. When you look at up to 6,000 customers, team building and getting the right people on board and joining that team within OwnBackup must be very, very important. And I'm sure it's taken huge consideration when hiring that person. What do you think, or what have you learned either from your previous experience or what you've learned within OwnBackup of the right individual building that team? And what advice would you share to other companies looking to try to scale like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think company culture is so important. I mean, if you look at successful companies, I mean, it's the backbone of. We had a customer panel the other week, and one of our big customers was talking about this. Someone asked him, "Why did you choose OwnBackup?" And he said, "It wasn't just the product; it was the people." He said, once we did a POC and figured out the product's outstanding and we loved it, it served our needs. The next thing we did is we wanted to see what these people were like. How does OwnBackup treat their employees? What's their culture? What are their values? And that aligned with them. And that was kind of the final box to check to become a customer. And it's the same way that the reason why I wanted to join. There are guys like Matt Kennedy and Jessica Wine, and they're just outstanding people, and it's the kind of people you want to be working with, and they inspire you. They're passionate, and it's probably one of the main reasons why I wanted to join the company.
Ryan, final question to yourself. You've come into the world of OwnBackup and the world of tech, and probably in a slightly different way than maybe the most. Maybe tell the audience your background and how you got into this world, and what advice would you offer to your younger self or people coming into the ecosystem?
Yeah, I guess my advice would be just always follow your passion. I think that leads you to where you're supposed to be. My passion was music. I was a musician. I played the piano since I was like 5 years old, and ended up doing that professionally, and had the opportunity to share the stage with like Willie Nelson and Alan Stone. And I had just taken a gig in Nashville, Tennessee with a country artist named Thomas Rhett. So I was Thomas Rhett's first keyboard player. I was living in Nashville, and that's indirectly got me into ServiceNow. A buddy of mine who's a musician as well, who owned a partner company, called me and was like, "Dude, what do you do when you're not touring?" And I was like, "Well, look for work." And he was like, "Well, we're partnering with this company, ServiceNow, and I think you'd be great to kind of help own that partnership and align us with ServiceNow and be our alliance director." And went to my first Knowledge about 10 years ago, and here I am today. So
it's great advice. Really, really good. Ryan and Jean, thank you very much for your time today. Really, really informative. For people that are listening in, I'm sure they got an awful lot from the conversation. I personally got an awful lot from the shared responsibility model, and just understanding, what steps need to be taken to manage your data, and what you perceive to be the reality actually isn't. So it's just been a couple of steps ahead of this as well. Thank you very much for your time.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for having us, Mark.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Aldus Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review. We are available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and any Android podcast of choice. You can also head over to our website, www.aldus.com, to listen to more podcasts, view our open roles, and stay up to date with industry news. Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for more great episodes coming very soon.